In the scorching heat of the Libyan desert, where the sun turns sand into molten glass and mirages dance on the horizon, one man was about to orchestrate the most brilliant tactical masterpiece of the Second World War. The year was 1942, and the world stood witness to something that would defy all military logic, shatter British confidence, and elevate a German general to legendary status. This is the story of Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, and the Battle of Gazala that sent shockwaves across every continent and changed the course of the North African campaign forever. Picture this. The British Eighth Army, one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world, had constructed what they believed to be an impregnable fortress stretching 40 miles across the desert. Thousands of tons of steel, concrete and barbed wire, over 100,000 seasoned troops, nearly 1,000 tanks, minefields so dense they were called the Mine Marsh. This was the Gazala Line, and to the British High Command, it represented the ultimate defensive position. No army on earth, they believed, could break through such a massive fortification. They were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. On the other side of this steel and sand barrier stood a force that, on paper, should never have stood a chance. 90,000 men facing 100,000. 560 tanks against 849. Stretched supply lines running thousands of miles across hostile territory. By every conventional measure of military strength, this German-Italian force was outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched. Yet leading them was a man whose name would soon echo through history books and military academies for generations to come. Erwin Rommel was not your typical World War II general. While other commanders sat in comfortable headquarters miles behind the front lines, Rommel drove his staff car directly into the heat of battle, personally leading tank charges and appearing wherever the fighting was fiercest. His soldiers called him the Desert Fox, a nickname that captured both his cunning and his ability to strike from unexpected directions. The British, despite being his enemies, would come to respect and fear him in equal measure. But what made the Battle of Gazala so shocking was not just who won, but how they won. This was not a grinding war of attrition where superior numbers eventually prevailed. This was not a siege where patience and persistence wore down the defenders. This was something entirely different. This was a masterclass in deception, mobility, and tactical innovation that would rewrite the rules of desert warfare. The strategic stakes could not have been higher. Control of North Africa meant control of the Suez Canal, the lifeline connecting Britain to its empire in Asia. It meant access to Middle Eastern oil fields that fueled the war machine of both sides. It meant dominance over Mediterranean shipping routes that could strangle or sustain entire nations. For the British, losing North Africa would be a disaster beyond imagination. For the Germans, capturing it would open pathways to victory that seemed impossible just months before. The timing was perfect for drama. By the spring of 1942, the war had reached a critical juncture. The German advance into Russia had stalled in the frozen wastes outside Moscow. The United States had entered the conflict, but was still mobilizing its vast industrial might. The Battle of the Atlantic raged as U-boats and convoys fought a deadly game of cat and mouse across the ocean. In this global chess match, North Africa represented one of the few theaters where a decisive victory might tip the balance of the entire war. The British had every reason for confidence as they surveyed their defensive masterpiece. The Gazala Line was not just a trench or a wall. It was a sophisticated network of fortified positions called boxes, each one a self-contained fortress bristling with artillery, machine guns, and anti-tank weapons. These boxes were surrounded by vast minefields and connected by communication networks that allowed for coordinated defense and rapid reinforcement. The entire system stretched from the Mediterranean coast at Gazala in the north to the oasis fortress of Bir Hakeim in the south, creating what military planners believed was an unbreachable barrier. Each box was designed to operate independently, like islands of resistance in a sea of desert. If the enemy attacked one position, the others could provide supporting fire while reserves rushed to reinforce the threatened sector. The spaces between the boxes were sown with hundreds of thousands of mines, creating killing fields where any attacking force would be channeled into predetermined zones of destruction. British engineers had spent months perfecting these defenses, incorporating lessons learned from previous desert campaigns and drawing inspiration from the most successful fortifications in military history. The defenders were not green recruits or second-rate garrison troops. The British Eighth Army represented the cream of Commonwealth forces, battle-hardened veterans who had already proven themselves in combat against Italian armies and earlier German offensives. South African divisions stood alongside British regulars, Australian units, and Indian brigades, creating a multinational force united by shared purpose and mutual respect. Their equipment, while not always the most advanced, was reliable and well-maintained, supported by supply lines that stretched back to factories in Britain, America, and across the British Empire. Meanwhile, intelligence reports reaching British headquarters painted a reassuring picture of their enemy. German forces appeared stretched thin, their supply lines vulnerable to interdiction by British naval and air forces operating from Malta and Egypt. Italian allies were considered second-rate at best, more likely to surrender than fight when the pressure mounted. Rommel himself, while acknowledged as a competent commander, was seen as reckless and prone to overextending his forces in pursuit of spectacular but ultimately unsustainable victories. This confidence extended all the way to the highest levels of British command. General Neil Ritchie, commanding the Eighth Army, had already begun planning his own offensive operations to drive the Germans back across Libya and potentially knock them out of North Africa entirely. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, desperate for good news to share with an increasingly war-weary British public, had high hopes that the Gazala Line would provide the decisive victory that had eluded British forces for so long. Yet even as British soldiers cleaned their weapons and checked their equipment in the shadow of their mighty fortifications, something was stirring in the German camps to the west. Reconnaissance flights reported unusual movement among enemy positions. Radio intercepts suggested increased activity in German supply depots. Local Arab informants brought whispered reports of tank columns moving under cover of darkness. The pieces were falling into place for one of the most audacious military operations of the Second World War. Rommel had spent weeks studying every detail of the British position, analyzing aerial photographs, interrogating prisoners, and personally reconnoitering forward positions in disguise. What he saw convinced him that the Gazala Line, for all its apparent strength, contained a fatal weakness that could be exploited by a commander bold enough to risk everything on a single throw of the dice. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shock the world and establish Erwin Rommel as one of history's greatest military tacticians. In just a few short weeks, the impregnable fortress would lie in ruins. Tens of thousands of British soldiers would be marching into captivity, and the strategic balance in North Africa would shift dramatically in favor of the Axis powers. The Battle of Gazala was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. The date was May 26, 1942. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the desert horizon, British sentries manning their forward positions noticed something peculiar. Artillery shells began falling on the northern sections of the Gazala Line, concentrated around the coastal positions where the Mediterranean met the sand. The bombardment was fierce but predictable, exactly the kind of frontal assault that British planners had anticipated and prepared for. General Ritchie received the reports with satisfaction. His intelligence officers had predicted that Rommel would attempt a direct attack on the strongest part of the line, and here was the proof. German infantry advanced under cover of the barrage, supported by tanks and armored vehicles that kicked up massive clouds of dust as they approached the wire obstacles. Radio chatter filled the airwaves as British commanders coordinated their response, moving reserves toward the threatened sectors and calling in artillery strikes on the advancing enemy columns. But something felt wrong to the more experienced observers. The German attack, while noisy and dramatic, lacked the concentrated fury they expected from Rommel. Tank movement seemed almost tentative, advancing just far enough to draw return fire before pulling back to safer positions. Infantry assaults reached the outer wire, but failed to press home with the desperate intensity of men fighting for their lives. Most puzzling of all, the normally aggressive German commander was nowhere to be seen along the front lines where he usually appeared during major operations. What the British could not see, hidden by the darkness and the swirling dust clouds, was the most audacious flanking maneuver in the history of desert warfare unfolding to their south. Under cover of night, The bulk of Rommel's armored force had begun a sweeping movement around the left flank of the Gazala Line. 3 entire divisions, including the elite Afrika Korps, were racing through the open desert in a massive arc designed to bring them up behind British positions by morning. The logistics of this operation were staggering. Thousands of vehicles, from massive tanks to delicate radio trucks, had to navigate treacherous terrain in complete darkness while maintaining radio silence. Fuel trucks struggled to keep pace with the armored spearheads, their precious cargo sloshing dangerously as they bounced over rocks and through wadis. Medical units, artillery batteries, and supply convoys stretched for miles across the desert, all moving with clockwork precision toward their assigned positions. Rommel himself rode at the very front of this steel serpent, his command vehicle equipped with extra radio sets that allowed him to maintain contact with every element of his force. This was leadership of the most personal kind, where a single commander could influence the course of battle through his physical presence and immediate decision-making. While British generals studied maps in air-conditioned trailers, the Desert Fox was breathing dust and feeling every bump in the desert floor alongside his men. The southern anchor of the Gazala Line was held by the Free French garrison at Bir Hakeim, a collection of Foreign Legion veterans and colonial troops from Chad and the Congo. These men, fighting under the Cross of Lorraine rather than the Union Jack, represented the hopes and dreams of a France that refused to surrender despite the humiliation of 1940. Their commander, General Pierre Koenig, was a tough professional soldier who had spent years in the colonies and understood both the value of defensive positions and the importance of making every shot count. As the sun climbed higher on May 27th, the true scope of Rommel's plan began to reveal itself. British observation posts reported large dust clouds moving north from the desert, but initial reports dismissed these as supply convoys or reconnaissance units. Only when the first German tanks appeared on the horizon, silhouetted against the morning sky like prehistoric monsters, did the magnitude of the threat become clear. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. British units that had been confidently facing west suddenly found enemy forces approaching from the east, from behind their own lines. Radio networks crackled with confused reports as commanders tried to make sense of contradictory information. How could German tanks be attacking from the rear when the main enemy force was clearly engaged to the front? Had the intelligence reports been completely wrong? Was this some kind of elaborate deception? Panic began to spread through the defensive network as individual commanders made desperate decisions with incomplete information. Some units turned to face the new threat, weakening their positions against the frontal assault. Others maintained their original positions, leaving their flanks exposed to the German sweep. The carefully coordinated defense that had been planned and rehearsed for months began to unravel in a matter of hours. But Rommel's masterstroke was far from complete. The German spearheads, racing through unfamiliar terrain at maximum speed, soon encountered problems that threatened to turn triumph into disaster. Fuel supplies, stretched thin by the longer-than-expected approach march, began running low just as the tanks needed them most. Mechanical breakdowns, inevitable when machines are pushed to their limits, left disabled vehicles scattered across the desert like metallic grave markers. Most critically, the French garrison at Bir Hakeim refused to collapse as German planners had anticipated. Instead of fleeing or surrendering when faced with overwhelming odds, Koenig's men dug in deeper and fought with a ferocity that surprised even veteran Afrika Korps officers. Every building became a fortress, every street corner a killing ground. The Foreign Legion, drawing on decades of colonial warfare experience, turned the oasis into a maze of death traps that channeled attacking forces into carefully prepared ambush sites. This unexpected resistance created a crisis that threatened the entire German operation. Supply convoys that should have been racing forward to support the advancing spearheads found themselves trapped south of Bir Hakeim, unable to reach their destinations without running a gauntlet of French fire. The German advance, which had begun with such promise, ground to a halt just when momentum was most crucial. Rommel faced the most critical decision of his career. His forces were scattered across 50 miles of desert, low on fuel and ammunition, facing counterattacks from multiple directions. The British, recovering from their initial shock, were beginning to coordinate a response that could trap his entire army in the open desert where superior numbers would inevitably prevail. Lesser commanders might have ordered a retreat, cutting their losses and returning to the safety of their original positions. Instead, the Desert Fox doubled down on his gamble, making a decision that would either secure his place in military history or destroy his army entirely. Rather than retreat, he ordered his scattered forces to concentrate in a defensive position that would become known as the Cauldron, a shallow depression surrounded by British minefields and defensive positions. It was perhaps the most audacious military maneuver of the entire war, deliberately placing his army in what appeared to be an inescapable trap. The situation that unfolded over the next 48 hours would test every ounce of Rommel's tactical genius and his army's fighting spirit. Trapped in what the British themselves dubbed the Cauldron, surrounded by minefields and hostile forces on all sides, the German commander found himself in a position that military textbooks would later describe as hopeless. His tanks were running on fumes, his ammunition supplies dwindling, and British artillery had found the range to his positions. Yet it was precisely in this moment of maximum danger that Rommel's true brilliance began to shine. While British commanders celebrated what they believed was the imminent destruction of the Afrika Korps, the Desert Fox was already planning his next move. He understood something that his enemies had not yet grasped. In warfare, the most dangerous animal is often the one that appears cornered, and he intended to prove that principle in the most dramatic fashion possible. The key to survival lay not in passive defense, but in aggressive action that would keep the British off balance and prevent them from coordinating their overwhelming advantages. Rommel began by personally leading supply convoys through the chaos, appearing wherever his presence was needed most. When fuel trucks became separated from their escorts in the confusion, he commandeered a reconnaissance vehicle and drove into the desert night to guide them to safety. When communications broke down between scattered units, he raced from position to position in his command car, coordinating attacks and repositioning forces with the speed and precision of a chess master playing against amateurs. The psychological effect of his leadership was electric. German soldiers who had been preparing for capture or death suddenly found their commander beside them, calm and confident despite the desperate circumstances. Tank crews who had been conserving their last shells received personal orders from their general to prepare for offensive operations. Artillery batteries that had been rationing ammunition were told to prepare for sustained bombardment. The message was clear. This was not a retreat or a last stand, but the beginning of something extraordinary. British forces, meanwhile, struggled to adapt to the fluid nature of the battle that was developing around them. Their defensive doctrine, so effective when facing predictable frontal assaults, proved inadequate when confronting an enemy that seemed to appear and disappear like smoke. German battle groups, operating with a flexibility that British commanders found almost incomprehensible, would strike hard at one position before vanishing into the desert, only to emerge hours later at a completely different location. The minefields that were supposed to contain the German forces became a double-edged sword. While they did limit Rommel's options for movement, they also prevented British armored units from exploiting their numerical advantage through rapid maneuver. Tank battles that should have been decisive became confused melees where superior German tactics and equipment quality began to tell. The famous 88mm anti-aircraft guns, pressed into service as tank destroyers, carved through British armor with devastating effectiveness. As June dawned over the Cauldron, the strategic situation began to shift in ways that no one had anticipated. The French garrison at Bir Hakeim, still holding out against overwhelming odds, had become far more than just an obstacle to German supply lines. Their desperate resistance was tying down Italian divisions that Rommel desperately needed elsewhere, while simultaneously inspiring Allied forces throughout the theater. Radio broadcasts from the besieged fortress, transmitted in multiple languages, carried reports of heroic last stands and impossible odds that captured the imagination of the world. General Koenig's men had transformed the oasis into a fortress that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of warfare. Legionnaires who had spent years fighting colonial wars in Indochina and Syria brought skills perfectly suited to this kind of desperate defense. They understood how to make every building a strong point, how to create interlocking fields of fire that maximized the effectiveness of limited ammunition, and most importantly, How to maintain morale when survival seemed impossible. The siege of Bir Hakeim became a battle within a battle, a microcosm of the larger struggle playing out across North Africa. German assault troops, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia, found themselves stymied by defensive techniques they had never encountered. Every advance was paid for in blood, every building taken only after room-to-room fighting that consumed precious time and irreplaceable experienced soldiers. Rommel recognized that the continued resistance at Bir Hakeim threatened to derail his entire operation. Supply convoys that should have reached his main force in hours were taking days to navigate around the besieged fortress. Worse, the delay was giving British forces time to recover from their initial confusion and begin mounting coordinated counterattacks against his exposed positions. The window of opportunity that had opened with his successful flanking maneuver was rapidly closing. The solution, when it came, demonstrated once again why Rommel was considered one of the war's most innovative commanders. Rather than continue costly frontal assaults against the French position, he began a systematic campaign to isolate and starve out the defenders. Artillery bombardments were coordinated with airstrikes to interdict supply drops and destroy communication equipment. Specialized engineer units began clearing narrow corridors through the surrounding minefields, creating supply routes that bypassed the fortress entirely while maintaining pressure on its perimeter. Meanwhile, in the main theater of operations around the Cauldron, British attempts to crush the trapped German forces were meeting with unexpected resistance. Each attack was met by carefully coordinated defensive fire that seemed to anticipate every move. German positions that appeared vulnerable from aerial reconnaissance proved to be elaborately camouflaged strongpoints bristling with anti-tank weapons. British armor, advancing confidently across what seemed to be open ground, found itself channeled into killing zones where concealed 88s waited in ambush. The tide began to turn when Rommel made another of his characteristically audacious decisions. Instead of waiting passively for British attacks, he ordered his forces to begin probing operations designed to identify weak points in the surrounding enemy positions. These were not desperate breakout attempts but carefully planned reconnaissance missions that gathered intelligence while keeping British commanders guessing about German intentions. What these probes revealed changed everything. The British defensive line, impressive though it appeared on paper, contained gaps and weaknesses that a skilled opponent could exploit. Communication networks that worked perfectly during planned exercises broke down under the stress of continuous operations. Supply lines that had seemed secure proved vulnerable to fast-moving raiding parties that struck without warning before disappearing back into the desert. Most critically, British command structure revealed itself to be rigid and inflexible when faced with rapidly changing circumstances. Orders that made sense when issued hours earlier became obsolete by the time they reached frontline units. Commanders who excelled at managing set-piece battles struggled to adapt when their carefully laid plans encountered the chaos of fluid warfare. The very size and complexity of the British force, which should have been an advantage, became a liability when rapid decision-making was required. Rommel sensed these weaknesses like a predator scenting wounded prey. His counterattacks, when they came, were precisely targeted at the points where British organization was most vulnerable. Instead of attempting to break through everywhere at once, he concentrated his limited resources on creating multiple simultaneous crises that would overwhelm enemy command and control systems. It was warfare as psychological manipulation, designed to create confusion and panic rather than simply destroy enemy forces. The breakthrough came on June 11th, when German engineers finally cleared a reliable supply route through the British minefields. Fuel trucks and ammunition convoys that had been circling uselessly in the desert for days suddenly began pouring into the Cauldron, transforming what had been a death trap into a springboard for offensive operations. Tank crews who had been conserving their last drops of fuel received orders to prepare for extended combat operations. Artillery batteries that had been silent for hours roared back to life with devastating effect. The psychological impact on British forces was immediate and catastrophic. Units that had been confidently preparing to deliver the killing blow to trapped German forces suddenly found themselves under sustained attack from positions they thought had been neutralized. The hunter had become the hunted in a reversal so swift and complete that many British commanders initially refused to believe their own intelligence reports. What followed would be remembered as one of the most complete tactical reversals in military history, a masterpiece of leadership and tactical innovation that would establish Rommel's reputation as one of warfare's true geniuses. The Desert Fox had turned apparent defeat into the foundation for his greatest victory, and the shockwaves would soon ripple across every battlefield of the Second World War. When the dust finally settled over the Libyan desert on June 21, 1942, the impossible had become reality. The impregnable Gazala Line lay shattered, its fortress boxes abandoned or captured, its minefields breached, its defenders scattered to the winds. 33,000 British Commonwealth troops marched into captivity at Tobruk, the largest surrender in British military history save for Singapore. The Desert Fox had achieved what every military expert declared impossible, transforming a numerical disadvantage into the most complete tactical victory of the North African campaign. But Gazala was more than just another battle won or lost. It was a revolution in warfare itself, a demonstration that innovation and audacity could triumph over superior numbers and defensive positions. Rommel had rewritten the rules of desert combat, proving that mobility and deception were more valuable than static fortifications and overwhelming firepower. Military academies would study his flanking maneuver for generations, while his ability to turn the Cauldron from trap into triumph became legend. The shockwaves reached far beyond the sand dunes of Libya. In London, Churchill faced a crisis of confidence that threatened his wartime leadership. Across the empire, commanders who had believed British forces invincible were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about tactics, leadership, and the changing nature of modern warfare. The myth of European invincibility in colonial theaters lay as broken as the Gazala Line itself. Yet perhaps the greatest shock was not tactical but psychological. The world had witnessed something extraordinary, a single commander whose genius could alter the course of history through pure force of will and tactical brilliance. Rommel had become more than a general. He had become a symbol of what was possible when conventional wisdom met unconventional thinking. The Battle of Gazala stands as testimony to a fundamental truth of warfare, that in the crucible of combat, leadership and innovation matter more than numbers on a spreadsheet. The Desert Fox had shocked the world, and nothing would ever be the same.